So this presentation is based on my book, Stringing Rosaries. And when I was a professor at NDSU, I did this research. I'll let you read this, please. So please take care of yourselves during and after this presentation. So I'm going to put down this screen here. My involvement in boarding schools has to do with my grandparents. My parents and my grandparents all went to boarding school. This is my grandfather, Ben Lajmadir, and his sister Martha. They were sent to Fort Taunton. This is from 1898, and he was 9 years old when he was sent there. And you can see the military uniform that the students had to wear at that time. And Martha probably did all the sewing of those uniforms that were that small. This is Mama. She is on the far right. I'm not sure which boarding school. I think this is at Wapton. So she was also sent there every year. And this is my father. He was sent he went to Fort Taunton, I understand. He told me, and then he ran away. So then he was sent to Chemawa, Oregon from Belcourt. And he's in the second to the bottom row from the right, the fourth one from the right. And he also was 9 years old. And he was what I call the stolen generation. He didn't speak a word of English. His mother, who also went to Fort Taunton, but she died in the 1918 flu epidemic. So he was 2 years old. So his father had two little ones and couldn't support them. And I'm sure he was in a lot of grief. So he gave my father to an old Cree couple. And so he was raised speaking pure Cree. And this is the art that he probably would have walked through. There's the uniforms. This is a little bit earlier than when he went in 1925. This is about the 1918 or so. And he was there in 1925. Same uniforms. He hated those boots and those little jodhopper pants, they're called. They said the boots were very painful and they had to do a lot of marching. This is the train station, and you can see the arch over to the left. I go there almost every year. I was there just recently, and I stand on the train tracks to just imagine what it would have been like for this little boy, 9 years old, not speak a word of English, kind of stolen by the Indian agent and thrown on a train with 5 other kids from Belcourt and sent 3 days and 3 nights to a strange state. This is a little boy's dorm. Papa said that one of his details, one of the duties they had was to shine up the wood floor of the little boy's dorm with kerosene. It's a miracle. They survived. Okay, just a real brief history. The rest of the Indian history, of course, you could have college classes for 5 years, but this is just a brief history. So the United States had an Indian problem, is what they called it. It was too expensive to keep up a war campaign. It would cost almost $1 million for each campaign against Native people, against their tribes. So President Grant's peace policy allowed religious denominations to undertake the work of civilizing the Indians. The Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions then was established, and boarding schools both on and off the reservation. So in 1891, Congress authorized a Commissioner of Indian Affairs to enforce compulsory attendance of Indian children. And they were told to withhold their rations, their food, like even the wood, meant for, in North Dakota, it gets pretty cold. It meant death for that old couple that was raised him. So it was forced removal. I call it the stolen generation. So Captain Richard Pratt, he started the first off-reservation federal boarding school. He was a rabid assimilationist. He liked Indians, but he hated the culture. The earlier with the Indian Wars, it was called the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And he instead believed to kill the Indian in him and save the man. So he started Carlisle. So this is from the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs memo sent out. I'll let you read that. So what happened with my father is that he was 9 years old when he was taken. So the old couple, they got him when he was 2 years old, and they actually hid him in the bush. Run, my grandchild, and he would go hide in the bush there by a lake until he was 9 years old. They had heard horror stories about these boarding schools, so they kept him hidden until finally they were threatened with jail if they didn't send him to school. There was no separation of church and state. The government gave money to Catholic schools to run their schools. So these are all the different boarding schools that ran the different Christian organization that ran boarding schools. Right now, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is working with the Quakers to locate their schools. I spent a week in Marquette looking for Catholic boarding schools, because no one has ever asked the government. When I started doing this research in about 2008, and no one ever asked the government or all these Christian organizations what schools they ran. So my father said he didn't have a choice of going to church. He said if you didn't go to church, you didn't eat. So he chose the Catholic Church when he was at Chemawa. So this is, let's see. Yeah, okay, so this is Little Flower School. This is in Fort Taunton. So Fort Taunton had the federal boarding school, and then it also had a Catholic boarding school. So this is an image that Pratt would like, this little savage Indian being counseled by an assimilated little Indian boy. He liked to do photos like this to show any potential donors how well he was assimilating the savage Indians. Okay. Help. Oh no. Oh, there you go. Okay.
Oh, good.
And this is another example of a priest with a little Indian boy. So one of for my book, I interviewed a lot of boarding school elders, and almost every one of them either saw or experienced sexual abuse. The worst was in the Catholic schools. So I did a multi-interview research study for my book, Stringing Roses. And it's a longer explanation, but these are the themes that evolved. And I'll go over each one of them individually. So I had put something in the newspapers around the state, and I asked people if they wanted to be interviewed. It either had good stories or not so good stories, and to contact me. So I had people from South Dakota, Minnesota, and all throughout North Dakota contact me about wanting to be interviewed. Someone said, I'll tell you stories that will stand your hair on end. So most of the people I interviewed were in their 70s and 80s. And and I had interviewed my father and my grandfathers before they passed away. My father passed away in 93. Mama passed away in 77. So I didn't get a chance to hear as many of her stories. So I would go to where the elders were most comfortable. I drove to their home, or sometimes an office, where I had a set protocol of questions to ask them. And so these are the themes that came out of the interviews. So the theme one, of course, this is an era of where it was total forced assimilation and forced Christianity. So many of them they weren't able to speak their language. And this, of course, was Kill the Indian in him and Save the Man. Richard Pratt would tell them, all that is Indian in you is dead. And the guy who ran, the Wilkinson who ran Chemawa, was one of Richard Pratt's buddies from the Civil War. So my father said he said, I just couldn't speak. I couldn't learn that language. He couldn't learn English. And when I found his report cards in one of the federal archives, and for about 6 months, there was no no grade for English. He said they would put like soap in his mouth, and then he would get big blisters in his mouth and was unable to eat because he couldn't speak English. My mom was locked in a closet. She went to Steuben in South Dakota. It's a Catholic boarding school. She was locked in the closet for not being able to speak English. And she said, I didn't care. I liked it in there. But the bad thing is they wouldn't let her out, and she peed her pants, and then they beat her with a belt for peeing her pants. Kids were put in dungeons. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Other people I interviewed said they were hit with rulers until their fingers were broken, and they weren't mended. They were shamed, ridiculed, punished, repeatedly told you dirty, didn't never amount to anything. And that in self-hatred or internalized oppression. Julia, that made me feel ashamed for being Indian, and is still with me today. She was 75 years old. So some wondered why their parents put them there. They didn't understand why they were put there. Roger said, when I was younger, I always wondered why my parents hated me, why they did that to me, sent me there. So then when they returned home, it's called The Returned. They didn't fit in. Some of them, like my father, didn't return home for 4 years because they couldn't afford to send him home during the summers. And they couldn't afford to come and get him either. And that was the issue with off-reservation boarding schools. Because they was on-reservation boarding schools like Fort Taunton, but at that time, they could go home, say evenings, and then they would still practice their culture, their language, their ceremonies, and Pratt hated that. So he wanted to get the kids as far off the reservation as they could. So what happened to so many of them is that, like my father and my mother went to school like up to 12 years. They didn't learn parenting styles. Where would they have learned to be parents? The only parenting style they learned was the physical abuse and the beatings and the trauma that they went through at boarding school. So that's a big issue across Indian country today. One of the legacies that's from boarding school era. So I've heard some of the most horrific stories of corporal punishment. Pratt used a military style of punishment. So like my father in 1925 and through, I don't know how many years that the boarding schools, both Catholic and federal, practiced marching. He had his uniform, he had a little wooden gun. When he was older, he had a regular metal gun, and they had to march everywhere they went. And he said they couldn't even look, side to side, or they would get hit. They would get severely punished. So they marched, they woke up to revelry, and they marched to their classes. They marched to eat, to dinner. So there was a lot of bells and whistles. So they were forced to kneel on broomsticks. My mom had to kneel on a broomstick again for not speaking English. Josephine said they made you kneel on a broomstick if you were bad. Oh God, that hurt. Demas went to school in Fort Taunton. And he said, for speaking Dakota, I had to kneel on a ruler with my hands in front of my face. If I leaned back, the father would grab my hair and hold me straight up. I can still feel my scalp hurting. And he was so traumatized by that, even though he continued to speak Dakota, he wouldn't speak it in public. He would only speak it like to his wife. Because he said, he was asked to say a prayer in public. He could still feel the pain of what that priest did to him. It's called stress torture, by the way. In Chimawa, my dad said 4 boys ran away from the school. They were brought into the cafeteria, and there was a beam. There was a rope put over the beam. They tied the boys' hands to the beam, and they pulled them up so that their little feet couldn't touch the floor. So again, torture and an example of like, if you run away, this is what's going to happen to you. And so they were paddled with a wooden paddle if they wet the bed. There was beating with belts, sticks, heavy boots with books were thrown at them. They were hit with fists until knocked out. Uncle said, he said that the nuns took the inner part of a tire, and that's what they beat him with. So one of the most horrific types of physical punishment was called the gauntlet, and this was practiced again across all boarding schools, Catholic and federal. So my father was teasing about one of the headmasters and the matron that they had a case for each other, and back then that meant they liked each other. Well, Pratt also had older students that he called lieutenants or captains, and they would help discipline the younger ones. So he got told on. So Papa said they laid him over a bed, they held his hands and they held his legs, and the boys lined up behind him and they hit him with a belt. And the thing was that if he was your friend and you hit him lightly, you would have to take his place. So my father passed out. He was put in an infirmary for 2 weeks because his back was pretty torn up. The belt had studs in it. And when I interviewed him, he said, I still have the scars. Now, I didn't see any scars on his back, but if he said there were scars on his back, by God, there were scars on his back. So they did kill a boy there, he said, from Browning, Montana. They ruptured his kidneys. So one of the questions I never thought to ask my elders or my father, my mom, my grandfathers was about sexual abuse, because it was such a taboo issue in any country. It just didn't happen, but it did at the boarding schools. And everyone I interviewed, either they were sexually molested or they witnessed it happening, and they were in what's called secondary trauma. So Roger said the sexual abuse would happen at night when all of us were sleeping. The brothers would come in and take someone out. When the kids came back, they would be crying. They didn't want to be touched, and they were always scared. No one ever talked about it. Not just priests, also nuns, also government school workers, the dorm workers. Most of the teachers didn't, but it was the dorm workers that had the kids and captive in the dorm. And so then, of course, the mental abuse, being told, you're savage, you're filthy Indian, you'll never amount to anything. That stuck with my parents, that's for sure. Oh, they were hungry. Someone sent me a tape from UND. They had interviewed teachers that worked at the Bismarck boarding school. And she said first time she went into the cafeteria with the kids, she could see worms in the food and the soup that the kids were eating. And she ran back to the kitchen and she told the head cook, who was a non-native lady, these kids there's worms in there, you gotta stop. And the lady told her they're used to it. She said she saw them cut off green part of meat and serve the meat to the kid. They were always hungry, and if they stole food, which often they did, they would get caught. There was severe punishment for them. And the sweet thing, though, is that everyone that I talked to that said they stole food, they always brought it back to the dorm and they shared it with everyone in the dorm. So there's other studies that show the kids were malnourished. Yeah, so the food was repetitive. They drank something called Postum, which is a sort of a coffee substitute, but not really. Okay. Yeah, and there's something called the outing program. My great-grandfather's brother was sent to Carlisle, and I have his records also. They're all digitized at Carlisle, which is remarkable. They were sent out also to white homes, mostly again as like child labor, and they weren't paid for it, and it was again assimilation. They wanted to have these kids go into these white homes to just be as white as they could be, or as European as they could be. Again, there was no oversight, so often they were beaten, and there was also sexual abuse that went on at these homes that they sent to for outing program. The forced child labor, most of the boarding schools back in the 20s and later, they had details for half a day. So Papa went to school half a day, and Mom went to school half a day, and then they had details. They worked in the kitchen. My father was assigned to be a carpenter apprentice, so they only went to school half a day. So even in the 40s or so, when my grandfathers graduated from, say, Fort Taunton, with an 8th grade certificate, he really didn't have an 8th grade education because he only went to school half a day. So they all said they had a really shoddy education. So I'd interviewed people that went to school at Fort Taunton, and they all, some of the men talked about these dungeons that they were put in. One was a friend's father that wouldn't speak English, refused to speak English, and he was thrown in what he called a dungeon at Fort Taunton. And he said it was pitch black in there, and he lost sense of if it was day or night. They would give him bread and water, and then close the top of the dungeon again. And he said he would just sing Sundance songs at the top of his lungs, and that probably made his stay longer. So I spend a lot of time at Fort Taunton, and the two young people that work there year round, they let me go look for these dungeons. So this is one of them, and this is the one that I believe that this elder said he was put down in. I had them go down there, and there was a ladder that was going down to this one in particular. It was under the boys' dorm, and I closed the lid and had them shut off their flashlights, and it was pitch black in there. And so the gal came back up the ladder, and the gentleman, a little bit heavier set, he came up and the ladder broke and scared the heck out of me. So he was able to get a couple more rungs, and as he got near the top, all of the rungs busted. Again, scared the heck out of me. When later, a couple years later, when I brought some elders there from Fort Taunton and told them this story, they said that probably the spirits of those boys that were put in there wanted to keep that gentleman down there. There's a lot of stories still of Fort Taunton. The people that work there, they work under their offices below the little boys' dorm. In the dead of winter, when it's 40 below and it's closed to the public, they'll hear little feet running upstairs. So one gentleman said, there's a little boys' dorm. There's two of them there's another one under the steps of the little boys' dorm, but he said across Calvary Square, there's another one that he was put in. So I grabbed those, my friends that work there, and we pulled up the linoleum, and here is another dungeon that was underneath there. We had to use a crowbar, but again, there were steps going down there. So this is a part of the torture that they did to kids that didn't speak English. So it'll be 3 years in March, April, in May, I believe, that Kamloops, information about Kamloops made national and international news in Kamloops, Canada. They found, they didn't find them. The elders there knew that there was over 200 unmarked graves, and they used ground penetrating radar. So we now know that there's at least 53 schools in the United States, that have cemeteries. So Chemawa has over 220 that a friend, Marcia Small, did a GPR to establish. So these are the reasons why we have cemeteries at boarding schools. This is what happened to some of the kids, the diseases. TB was pretty rampant. Pneumonia, something as measles killed a lot of kids. And again, they didn't have the funds to send these kids home. Sometimes they did. But like for 1918 in Chemawa Cemetery, I think there's 18 kids buried there that weren't able to be sent back home. And during the years that my father was there, the 4 years that he was there, he was a carpenter apprentice. I counted, I think, about 24 kids that died. And I think 11 or so of them were boys. And I wondered if Papa probably had to build the coffins for these boys. And a researcher I met with last summer said he probably did. More reasons for cemeteries. Dad said that one kid at least committed suicide on the train, that I showed you coming in. And the other kid, the gunshot while running away, he was running away, and there was a man that owned a store nearby. The campus of Chemawa is like a little city, and he thought he was trying to break into a store, so he shot and killed the little boy that was trying to run away. So this is a dorm. The Chimawa was first built in Forest Grove. It's about 10 miles away from Chimawa. So this looks like a nice little dorm, but then the researcher I talked to, she said, well, look at the beds. There's 2 pillows. So there's 2 boys to a bed, and then their uniforms are hanging up behind it. So if any of these diseases that I just showed you, it would just go rampant through these dorms. And my father said, he said sometimes they would wake up and the boy next to them would be dead. And I said, what happened? And he said that they died of lonesomeness. So now maybe you are more familiar with the term. Or now it just went on in my head. Well, they just died of being lonesome or failure to thrive. Yeah, for lonesomeness, not eating. Some of them just refused to eat. They were just so terribly lonesome. So, like I said, I spent a lot of time at Chimawa. This is the cemetery, 1886. Huge trees. Someone had come in, the Bureau of Indian Affairs had come in, and there was cement markers, and they wiped those all out, and then they had the kids make little flat plaques, so it's easier to mow. But when they were doing the GPR, it showed that some of those cement plaques were put where the kid's body wasn't, so they're mismarked, and there's graves there that aren't marked. So it's pretty sad, but I go there and visit and offer tobacco and say prayers for the spirits of the kids that didn't get to come home. This is an example of a flat plaque. So I'll talk a little bit more about the legacy, but these are some of the mental health issues that the people that I interviewed had, that they talked about. So one gal could not go into brick buildings, say a brick hospital. It reminded her of the boarding schools, closets. A priest molested one of the gals for quite a few years. And when another priest would come in, he'd lock her in a closet. And she said she had problems down there from the sexual abuse, but the priest would bring her into the town, of course, so she could never, was scared her to death, never able to tell what was happening with her. Something called unresolved grief. I'll talk about that in a minute. Relationship issues, like my father became alcoholic, so after he left the boarding school, he ended up being the return, not able to fit in back home. So he ran away. He worked in the rodeo circuit in Montana, changed his name to Joe Harper, and then joined the CCC. Maybe some of you are old enough to know the Civilian Conservation Corps. From there, he joined the Army. And he always said the Army was a piece of cake compared to boarding school because of all the marching that they had to do. And then that was 9 weeks before Pearl Harbor hit, and he was sent to the Aleutians. And that's a whole nother story that I'm going to Anchorage, Alaska in a week, and I hope to go out to the World War II Aleutian Memorial on Alaska Island, and just talk more. I interviewed my father about his war years. So he became an alcoholic, and a pretty violent alcoholic, but he parented us the way he was parented, as many boarding school survivors did, with the belt, with beatings, and with verbal abuse. So now I understand, after doing this research, I understand more about why my parents parented the way they did. My mom would make us kneel in the corner. We didn't have to kneel in a broomstick, but you girls get to your corner, and we kneel there for 30 minutes. I mentioned already they had to work half a day, and then they went to school for half a day. This is the type of training that Pratt wanted the kids to have. There was no encouraging to go on to high school or on to college. These are the type of training. So my father was in carpentry. They wanted us to do farming, but when these kids went back to the reservations, a lot of the banks wouldn't loan them money to start a farm or to start get the equipment that they needed. Dad said tinsmithing. He said they didn't even have that when they went back to the res. Blacksmithing, these were useless. Maybe bricklaying helped, plumbing, baking. So my father did the best he could to make a living for us as a carpenter. And of course, the females. This is all they were told, you are to just get married. They were encouraged to marry white men. And this is all they were. So my mom, she taught me how to sew, of course, do the laundry, darning socks, taught me how to knit. We cleaning house. We had to clean the corners of our house with a knife, from mopping. I did the ironing. She taught me how to crochet, just to keep house. We washed our walls every week. It's like, what for? Yeah. So the only thing I didn't want to do was cooking. I finally said I'm done. And to this day, I don't like cooking, but I can sure sew up a storm. So these are pictures I got from Chemawa when I was there this summer. I told him, it says weird that they took them outside, but if you know anything about what is this called, wet plate, the old type photography where the kids had to be still, so they would have to just sit really still while he took this photograph with the light outside. But you can see that it shows them. A girl on the left is sweeping. Someone is working, I think, called a mangle for sheets, and then the clothes are drying. The little tiny girls there, look how young they were, taken as young as 2 years to boarding schools. Little girls have, I think, little babies, or can't quite see what they're doing. Over to the right, they're sewing. Interesting photo. And again, this was taken outside, a classroom outside. How young the babies are, and their uniforms. And the dresses, the girls had to sew all their dresses. So no one had ever asked the Bureau of Indian Affairs or churches how many schools they ran. So for about 12 years of my life, well, I had a little backstory. I had gone up to the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada. They went through Canada, and they took the commissioners, the 3 commissioners. They took testimony of boarding school survivors all throughout Canada, and they asked me I got to go up to Whitehorse, Yukon, to be an outside observer of their truth-telling process. And I remember this is about I think 2010 or so when I went up there. And at supper that night, the commissioners asked me, well, how many boarding schools does the United States have? Because they knew there was, I think, 130 boarding schools. They knew exactly where they were. They knew that there was 80,000 students that were still survivors. And in the end, they had interviewed 40,000 people. And there was a class action suit against the Canadian government by boarding school survivors. We can't do that here in the United States because of statute of limitations. But so $5 billion was kicked loose eventually over the years to do the work. And they were a boarding school survivor up there. I think they got a base of $10,000 for each year that they were there at a boarding school. So there was money that was given to these survivors. And then there was up to maybe $250,000 if you could prove that you were sexually molested, which was hell on the survivors to prove. It just re-traumatized them horribly. So they asked me how many boarding schools, and I'm representing the United States, and I had no idea. So no one had ever asked the BIA or the churches how many schools they ran. So I made it my goal in life and as a professor to search for boarding schools, and that was like a 12-year journey. We still don't know how many boarding schools there are. So over the years, I've found 408 schools. And in my latest printing of my book, I have a list there. The first printing, I developed a map with the help of the folks at NDSU. So this is only 366 schools. So the first printing is out of date already. And 408 schools in 31 states. So the Secretary Deb Haaland, she got involved with it. So when Kamloops happened, Secretary Deb Haaland was in place. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition was in place. They had been in place since 2011. I'm one of the founding members of that organization. They're operating out of Minneapolis. And then my book was in place. So it was this perfect storm. And I got calls from Al Jazeera English, from China, from New Zealand, and other, CNN. So I did a lot of interviews. So we had been working since 2011 for the Boarding School Healing Coalition to bring this issue to a national conscious, to the awareness of the legislature. And so it took Secretary Deb Haaland being in place that has shook loose a lot of monies. And she commissioned researchers to go throughout the United States and look for boarding schools. So they have if you go to the NAB's website, you'll see an interactive boarding school map, which is just incredible. It took them 4 years to just do that. I think they've come up with 500 schools, but their definition of boarding schools and mine kind of are a little bit different. I included some orphanages that said they were orphanages, but they were really boarding schools. They also included boarding schools in Hawaii, which I didn't include. So we're still looking at boarding schools. And I mentioned already that there's over 50 of them that they found unmarked graves. And they're not listing those schools publicly because they don't want people to go and look around or whatever may happen. So that's still been a journey to just find the boarding schools. Like I said, I spent a week at Marquette looking through 35 dusty files, huge files that had maybe 20 files in each one. It said day school, boarding school, day school, boarding school, and so on. So was it perfect research? No, but it's the best I could do with what I had, with what I could do. So these are the boarding schools alone in North Dakota. So Wahpeton is still presently it's called the Circle of Nations, so it's still operating. But so there's still a lot of boarding schools still operating across the United States, but they have oversight of tribes. That Native people are on the board. This is Carlisle. It's the first off-reservation federal boarding school. Look at all these babies that they took from their homes. Look at those little ones up front. They're so tiny. Like I said, as young as 2 years old. Some of these look like they're 4 or 5 years old. And that's his office. I've been to Carlisle a few times. It is now a war college. And they have a cemetery there, and tribes are starting to bring back their babies that were buried there. I think the Cheyenne, Sioux, one Alaska. There's 2 just brought back to Sisseton, and I think 1 in Fort Totten also. So some of the tribes, their beliefs are that the kids that are buried there need to stay there. Other tribes say their spirits are not resting and they want their babies back home. So the Department of Army is working with them, and they haven't been fun to work with. But more tribes are bringing their babies back home from that cemetery. This is Belcourt. So when I was in Marquette, the archivist there, he said, well, you know, there was a boarding school in Belcourt. And I go, no, there wasn't. Well, yeah, there was. And I know the location now. There's still the footprint of it there in Belcourt, but I was stunned. So it burned down. And there was one earlier than this that I found from the late 1800s. It was in St. John and started by Father Malo, but he couldn't afford it. He couldn't afford to keep running the boarding school, and I guess the federal government didn't help him with funding at that time. I forgot which school this is. This is one of the schools again in North Dakota. I think this is Fort Yates. But Pratt liked these pictures of these kids that were being assimilated. So the legacy. So intergenerational trauma and historical trauma. is a collective emotional and psychological injury over a lifespan and across generations resulting from the cataclysmic history of attempted genocide. It is a legacy of numerous traumatic events a community experiences over generations. Over successive generations, we have experienced traumatic assaults that have had enduring consequences for our families and our communities. So the historical trauma, my uncle was 96 years old. He passed away a few years ago, but I would go to Oregon and just sit and spend a couple of weeks just sitting with him. And we have a picture of my great grandmother, his grandmother, and he said she was mean. And I said, well, Uncle, how come she was mean? And he thought for a few minutes and he said, well, she saw the Indian Wars. So she saw the Indian Wars, and then her Arab saw the treaty put on a reservation. So she sent her 4 boys to boarding school. One of them was my grandfather, my mom's father. And then they sent my mom to boarding school. So there's something called epigenetics that someone more involved in understanding that. But it's like DNA. So the trauma that my great grandmother witnessed from the Indian Wars was passed down epigenetics through my DNA to me, and probably, and well, it sounds like to my daughter, my grandkids, and now I have 4 great grandbabies. So that's the intergenerational trauma. I broke that cycle of abuse for my father with my kids, even though there was a period when psychologically I couldn't hug my daughter, and I go, what is wrong with me? But it wasn't till learning that I was probably at the age when, because my parents never hugged us and never said that I love you. So I had a hard time saying that to my daughter. Broke that with my grandkids when I understood through this research what was happening to me, and I put myself through a lot of therapy and a lot of counseling to undo the trauma of how I was raised and disciplined. So there's historical unresolved grief resulting from the historical trauma of genocide, grief that has not been expressed, acknowledged, and resolved. So many of the boarding school survivors that we're interviewing have never told their family what happened to them. When I would interview you, I would send the transcript back to you, and you could change anything or delete or add anything. Several of the boarding school survivors said, no, I don't want it sent to me because I don't want my kids to ever read it or my grandkids to ever know what happened to me. They had only told their husbands. So there was this resounding silence, I say in my book, across Indian country about boarding school abuse. And it's just now, we are just now beginning the truth telling here in the United States. So disenfranchised grief is grief that can't be publicly mourned. One of the survivors said, when was a good time to tell my family that I had been molested at boarding school as a boy? During Thanksgiving dinner. So what's happening now is that with the Boarding School Healing Coalition, like I'm going to Anchorage and we are interviewing boarding school survivors. We now have a vehicle, a format, a safe place for the boarding school survivors to start telling their stories. So we're just now starting the truth telling. There's something that's been called the boarding school syndrome. It's PTSD, including recurring intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks, detachment disorder, deficient knowledge of traditional culture, cultural skills, trouble sleeping, poor anger management, and deficient parenting skills and tendency to abuse alcohol or drugs. So there's also a legacy of adverse childhood experiences, which disrupts the brain, leading to higher likelihood of negative health outcomes as adults, including heart disease, obesity, diabetes, autoimmune diseases. We suffer from disproportional cycles of violence, abuse, disappearances, the missing murdered Indigenous women and men, health disparities, substance abuse, premature death, and undocumented psychological trauma. So boarding schools represent a deliberate policy of ethnocide and cultural genocide and human rights abuses. The survivors called them somewhere between dungeons and death camps. They were overcrowded, understaffed, underfunded, had limited resources, and places where diseases ran rampant. So I want to talk a little about the soul wound with my father. So I brought the video. I found a video called "In the White Man's Image," and it was one of the first videos and documentaries about boarding schools I'd ever seen. And this is before he passed away in 1993. And I brought it to him and showed it to him because it mentioned Chemawa as being the second boarding school started. By the way, there was Carlisle, and then the second boarding school was started in Oregon, and that's where my father was sent. And so I showed him the video, and when he got done, and it told everything like what I'm just talking about, with the trauma that kids went through and the type of abuse and so on. And he put his head in his hands and he said, "So that's what the goddamn hell they were trying to do to us." So I call that his soul wound. And because we didn't hug or anything like that, I couldn't comfort him. But it was, man, it just hit me in the guts that he never knew. And he passed away the following year. He never knew why he was sent to boarding school and why as he never spoke a word of his language again after all the beatings and the lice soap. He never spoke a word. Neither did Mama. That was completely taken away from him. So that's his soul wound. He never knew why he was sent to boarding school, and that did me in. So what we're doing right now with NAB and what we're going throughout the country for the next 2 years, we're going to these at least 20 states is trying to do healing for them. We say that we're only as healthy as our secrets. So we're giving an opportunity for boarding school survivors to tell their story. We're taking care of them mentally, physically, spiritually during these sessions. We're taking good care of them. We check on them a week after I interview them. This is Oklahoma, and then a month after we continue checking on them. So that's what we're trying to do with what we're doing right now with interviewing boarding school survivors. So these are some of the healing that we need to do right now. The survivors said, we want our language back, we want our culture back. Culture is treatment. They want a return to tribal spirituality. So how do we forgive the unforgivable was a question that was asked. It starts with the family. So I had to work with forgiving my parents with raising me the way they were raised. So compensation, we can't do that here in the United States because of statute of limitations. Some boarding school survivors have said they want an apology from the government like they did in Canada. Others have said that I'll never get my childhood back. I don't care about an apology. Well, we are working on, NABS is working on an apology. And then what does that look like? We need boarding school survivors to write that apology. So it would come from them, not from the government, but the government would give the apology. I believe in apology. I saw what it did in Canada. They said it was a recognition of what was done to us, was important for their personal healing. So, and then reclaiming history, culture interventions, and therapeutic healing. So in Canada, they have a hotline that boarding school survivors can call. So when the graves were found, the information, the graves in Canada hit, the people that I interviewed for the book, some of them called me and it re-triggered them. But we didn't have a hotline or anything. We don't have anything in the United States that survivors can call and talk to people about, like what happened to them and how they were viewed. I was really concerned about them and told them, please go back into talk therapy or ceremony, talk to me, whatever was needed. So we have a long ways to go for healing here in the United States. There's some bigger general issues that our communities need to look at. So Canada has 103 initiated programs. It's supposed to be on and off reservations, focused on health and well-being. Has to come from the community. So I had to do my personal healing, and then we look at tribal healing. So we've had a lot of ceremonies in our tribe and walks, and there's something called Orange Shirt Day. So there's still a lot of work that we need to do here in the United States. So I encourage all of you to join NABS. Go online, it's free. You can donate if you want. The monies are, part of the monies I know are spent on academic scholarships for boarding school survivors, mostly their children and grandchildren now. There is a bill that NABS, the director of NABS and so on, is in Washington, D.C. quite often. It's called a Truth and Healing Bill. It's not truth and reconciliation like in Canada. There's a long ways between telling the truth and then reconciliation with the government. So we're going for truth and healing. So we just now starting truth telling. So this committee would go throughout the United States and do just exactly what they did in Canada. They would take testimony from boarding school survivors, but ask them, what do you need for healing? And then hopefully monies would be kicked loose for healing programs throughout the communities. Most of the people, it's sort of like what's happening at the Holocaust. A lot of the people that went through the worst of the Holocaust are starting to die and pass away. And it's the same thing with the worst of the era of the boarding school. They're in their 80s and 90s. They're starting to pass away, but they've told me, please tell the world what happened to us so that they'll never forget. And that's what I will continue doing until I can no longer speak. It's an Orange Shirt Day. I'm not sure my time, I can't see. There's an Orange Shirt Day that came out of Canada. This is a story by this Phyllis up in Canada. She knew she had to go to boarding school, so her mom bought her a really pretty orange shirt. And when she got to school, the nuns ripped it off her, burned it, and so on, and she never saw it again. And she was traumatized by orange shirts for the rest of her life. And then somehow she turned that trauma into something positive. She wrote a children's storybook. And now Canada has a National Orange Shirt Day. I think it's the last day in September 29th, where for healing for boarding school, as many people as we can in Canada wear orange. And we've adopted it here in the States, which is so cool. So we have orange t-shirts, let the healing begin, boarding school healing. So we've adopted Orange Shirt Day here in the United States for the survivors. And this is what my tribe did. We had a teepee and we were invited to write the names of all of our boarding school survivors, and friends were calling across the country saying, put my mom's name in, my grandfather's name. So we did. So there's an example of an orange shirt. I made an orange ribbon skirt. And the kind of the cool thing that happened, even though this was written in black permanent ink, over the winter, the names faded away. So there's got to be a metaphor or something there somewhere, but the teepee is still standing.